Hosted by u/soft_ordinary_5259. For some background, I have 50-50 custody of my 2 boys with my ex-girlfriend. To make this easier, I'll give them names. My son George just turned 13 this month. He's a bit less physically developed than what's typical for his age. He hasn't hit a growth spurt yet and is one of the shortest boys in his class. If you saw him, you'd probably guess he's around 10 or 11 rather than 13. He didn't show any signs of puberty until August. This might not seem relevant, but it is. George is very bright, projected to get 8s or 9s in his GCSEs, General Certificate of Secondary Education exams, and regularly achieves these grades in his mock exams and assessments. But he struggles with making friends and has dealt with bullying in the past. Things are better now, but he's still far from being a popular kid at school. As part of his product design class, he had to create a children's toy and give a sales pitch to the class. Last Friday was the presentation day, and George was really excited. He'd put a lot of effort into his toy and the presentation. That's why I was shocked when I got a notification from the school app saying George had been given a C3, after school detention, something he's never received before. The reason? He'd refused to participate in class and didn't do his presentation. Since they're not allowed phones during school hours, I couldn't message him to ask what had happened. When I picked him up, I could tell immediately that he was upset. I asked him what happened and why he didn't do the presentation. At first, he was hesitant to explain. He said he didn't refuse the presentation. When it was his turn, he asked to go later. His teacher said no and that he had to do it then or get a C3. George said he couldn't do it now, but didn't explain further when asked, so he was given the C3. I was still confused as to why he didn't want to present when asked, so I kept pressing him, worried that maybe he was being bullied again. Eventually, he told me the real reason. If you're a guy, you'll understand, but he randomly had an embarrassing thing happen down there, and, no matter what, it wouldn't go down. With that information, I think George's request was perfectly reasonable. He didn't refuse to do the presentation, he simply asked to do it a little later. Obviously, he didn't want to explain the reason in front of the whole class when the teacher asked him. His mom was really angry with him for getting the C3 and confiscated his Xbox. I tried explaining what happened and said I didn't think George was wrong. Since it was my week, I decided I wouldn't support the detention and would pick him up at the normal time. When I told his mom, she looked disgusted and said something like, "Why did he even have one in class to begin with?" I explained that it can randomly happen, especially in early puberty, and doesn't always relate to dirty or intimate thoughts, which is what she was assuming. She replied, "Well, I'm not sure that's true," dismissing what I said. So I told her, "You might not be sure, but I am." She insisted that we needed to present a united front, along with the school, and that by going against her, I was sending George the wrong message. I asked why her way of handling it was automatically right and why I should be the one to concede. It escalated into a big argument, which we haven't had in years. We aren't friends, but we usually get along fine, and she's usually reasonable. She's saying she is going to punish him for refusing when it's her week with him next week and that I am being a jerk for going against her. Her mother texted me, saying I was setting a bad example for George by letting him get away with being disrespectful to his teacher, which he wasn't. He just asked to do his presentation later. I respectfully told her she should mind her own business and that George was my son. But now I'm worrying whether I've done the right thing, and I need some outside perspectives. Update 5 days later. I wanted to come on and give a little update about how I handled everything with George and his school and clarify some things as well. I'm writing this on Sunday the 27th, and it's currently half term for George, so he has a week off school. Firstly, George was never able to give his presentation, which he was really upset about because he had worked so hard on it. But the presentations aren't graded. I think this is a difference between the US and English education systems. We don't generally have graded projects, at least I never did, and neither does George. Also, side note, we can't repeat a year, or grade here. At George's school, he gets his effort grades at the end of each term, and he does a mock GCSE style exam at the end of each year. We receive the results, but these don't actually matter. They're just to give insight into how they're doing and to provide practice for his real GCSEs when he's in year 11. On to another thing, many people commented that I should have shown him the old lift and tuck. I can tell you he already knows the trick. His school requires that he wears formal suit trousers, and if anyone has worn those types of trousers before, you know you can't do the lift and tuck effectively, and even if you could, an unnatural indent would still be easily noticeable. Okay, on to what happened with his school. So his head of year rang me after school on Tuesday, and we arranged a meeting on Wednesday. I told George that he didn't have to share the details of exactly why he didn't want to do the presentation unless he felt comfortable sharing them. I wasn't going to force it out of him. The class teacher who gave him the after-school detention didn't come to the meeting, so it was just me, George, and his head of year. His head of year is a really decent guy, and he has a great relationship with George. His head of year started by saying he was shocked when he learned that George had been given a C3, as it was so unlike him, and he asked what had happened. As I mentioned, George has a great relationship with the head of year, so he began trying to explain. He didn't say, "I had a so-and-so down there." Instead, he said something along the lines of, "Something embarrassing was happening with my body, and I just couldn't stand up when teacher's name called me." The head of year looked slightly puzzled for a brief moment, but then, I think, he realized what George was trying to say and responded with something like, "Oh, no need to explain further. I was a teen once too. I understand. I went on to talk about how they're aware he has a history of bullying, struggles with friends, and how I felt the teacher could have handled the situation differently. The head of year agreed, said he would discuss it with the teacher, and that he would cancel the C3 for George. I thanked him, and he encouraged George to come to him with any problems in the future instead of just getting upset and staying quiet. I thanked him again. Now, on to George's mother. I wish I could say things went as well with her as they did with the school. I'm honestly not sure what's going on with her. She isn't usually like this. A lot of people were commenting that she sounds very unreasonable. In that moment, I agree with you, but normally she is not like that, and we have a great friendship even though we're no longer in a romantic relationship. She ended up calling George to tell him that she wanted him to go to the C3 whether it had been cancelled or not. George rightly said that was ridiculous and that he wasn't going to do that. They both ended up having a huge argument. She then sent me a tirade of messages about how disrespectful I am. I'm not, how I'm raising him to be entitled, not true, and how he'll end up in prison because he doesn't understand consequences. He won't, and he does. I turned off notifications for her messages and just left her to it. I'm supposed to drop the boys off at her house tomorrow for her week with them, but George has said he doesn't want to go. At this point, I'm of two minds on whether to support that decision or not. On one hand, I wouldn't want her to ever encourage either of the boys to not spend their week with me, but on the other hand, it should be his choice. I feel like I'm walking on thin ice here, and I'm honestly not sure how to navigate it. I could stay out of it completely and just let him make the choice, but maybe encourage him to spend his week with her because I think that's how I'd like her to handle it. I do feel really conflicted. If you read all this, thank you.